Now we're going to go into some common use cases for the API, which will include environment verification, user administration, and in this video, automate process promotion. Before we dive in, there are a couple of notes and limitations to consider. When updating environment extension values through the API, the entire set of values must be provided in the request. So you cannot have partial updates because they will not be supported. This means the request must contain all the values for all the extended fields, not only the ones that are to be changed. So if an extended field is omitted in the update, the value will actually be removed. The only exception is encrypted passwords. The client application may wish to query and maintain a local copy of the list of process and environment names and internal IDs for convenience. And that might make more sense as we look through our upcoming example. New deployments for additional components such as API, certificate, and process route can be created via the API. However, there is a limitation that the deploy process API to copy promote deployments between environments still only supports process type components. And finally, the use of the generic component environment attachment and component atom attachment APIs are preferred over the legacy process environment attachment and process atom attachment. This use case assumes that the target environment has already been created, the atom or the cloud runtime has been installed, and that the runtime has been attached to the given environment. So the steps to automating process promotion are as follows. In the first step, you manually deploy to the first environment. So here the developer will manually attach and deploy the initial deployment version to the first environment using the Atomsphere platform. Although the APIs exist to attach and create the new deployment version programmatically, it's recommended to create the initial deployment manually after successful unit testing. So this will allow the developer more control over all of the components involved with the given change. The developer would also then set the extensions, and for scheduled processes, the developer would also configure the schedules. The second step would be to verify the attachment. So you can use the query operation of component environment attachment with a component ID equal to that particular process and the environment ID equal to the target environment. If a result is returned, no further action is required. Otherwise, the client application calls the create method of component environment attachment with a component ID equal to that particular process ID and the environment ID equal to the target environment ID. The third step is to set extensions. After the process is deployed, you can query the environment extensions object with the target environment ID, and this overlays the desired new values and calls update environment extensions. Alternatively, the user can manually configure any new environment extension values that might be required through the user interface. The fourth step is to configure any schedules. So firstly, you would query the environment atom attachment object with the target environment ID. Then for each atom ID that's returned, you can query process schedules with that particular atom ID and process ID equal to the process ID to schedule. Then you can update the process schedules with the ID of the process schedule ID, the target atom ID, and the process ID to schedule for each desired process. And the fifth and final step would be to promote to the next environment. And this note is important to mention, the deploy process API only supports process type components. For other component types, you will need to copy and promote them manually to the next environment. First, you can query the deployment object with the component ID and the environment ID and current equal to true to retrieve the current deployment ID from the source environment. Next, get from the deployment object with the deployment ID to retrieve the digest. Then verify attachment to the target environment, as we did in step 2. Next, deploy process with deployment ID equal to the source deployment ID, digest is equal to the source deployment digest, and environment equal to the target environment ID. And lastly, set extensions and schedule on the new environment.